Thank you, Robert. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Ron Haskins. Ron is a senior fellow in economic studies and co-director of the Center in Children and Families at the Brookings Institution. He's also senior consultant at the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore. From February to December of 2002, he was the senior advisor to the President for Welfare Policy at the White House. Prior to joining Brookings and Casey, he spent 14 years on the staff of the House Ways and Means Human Resources Subcommittee, first as welfare counsel to the Republican staff, then as the subcommittee's staff director. From 1981 to 1985, he was senior researcher at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He also taught and lectured on history and education at UNC Charlotte and developmental psychology at Duke University. Please help me to welcome Ron Haskins to the stage.
Thank you. That's a Las Vegas greeting, I guess. So let me tell you about the first time I came to Las Vegas. It was 1996 or 97, right after Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, and I was on the staff of the Ways and Means Committee. The chairman of the committee was a Southern gentleman named Bill Archer from Texas. And Bill Archer was the opposite of the way most of you probably think of members of Congress. He was extremely prim and proper, a man of great principle. He never took a dime from a political action committee. I think he might have been the only person in Congress who filled out his own tax form. And he did not like staff to travel. So many of us who had traveled when we were in the minority, now we're in the majority, is a little more spotlight, and we decided, well, the chairman won't be too happy with us, so maybe we won't travel very much. Well, right about this time, we're locked in a big debate over welfare reform, which was, I was the staff member most directly responsible. And the National Conference of State Legislators invited me to come to Las Vegas to give a talk. So I talked to the staff director, and I think he wound up talking to Archer about it. Anyway, they decided this would be good because we really needed the National Conference of State Legislators to support us. So I came to Las Vegas, and because of the schedule, I got here at about, I think I got here at 11 or 11:30 at night, went right to the hotel, went to bed, got up in the morning. The meeting was at 8:30. I gave my talk, went back to the airport. I don't think, I was in, I was in Las Vegas for maybe 12 hours. So everything seemed fine, and when I got back, the staff director said, "Did everything go okay? You didn't hang out in any bars, do anything what?" No. Did you spend any money gambling? No, I didn't. So about 3 months later, the National Journal, which is like the most important publication in Congress, decides that they're going to have a feature on staff travel. And they have a box over on the right-hand column, and it says something like notorious staff travelers. And you go down, you about the fourth one down. Ron Haskins went to Las Vegas. Well, Chairman Archer saw that. So he invited me to come to his office for a discussion. And I, used all the kind of excuses. But that was my first trip to Las Vegas. Now, hopefully, this one will turn out okay, and maybe Mr. Archer will not find out about it. He's retired now. It couldn't do anything to me anyway. So I'm glad to be here. And one thing that I'm especially glad about is to have an opportunity to talk about a book that we just wrote. Scholars always love to talk about the books that they just wrote. And my colleague, Belle Sawhill, who's also Brookings, she's an economist on the team. I'm a psychologist. Belle was in the Clinton administration. I was in the Bush administration. Belle is a lifelong Democrat. I'm a lifelong Republican. And she's an economist. I'm a psychologist. And the differences go on and on and on. We've been very close since roughly 2000 when I first came to Brookings and we started this center together. That's why I came to Brookings, so we could open this center. And we have been very close and gotten along very well. And I'm very proud of this book. I'm glad we finished it, but it almost cost us our relationship, as you might imagine. We did not see eye to eye on many things. And that really was part of the book, that we could look at the issues of poverty and opportunity in the United States. And even though we differed, we could agree on policies. And that's what the policy world should do. And right now in Washington, as all of you probably know, the policy world is not very good at that. At least the Congress, the House and the Senate are not very good at it. Although we have passed legislation, as you know, but it's been extremely partisan, unnecessarily partisan, I think, and unnecessarily bitter. So they're not paying any attention to it. Can you imagine we wrote this wonderful book and they're not paying any attention to it? But we managed to make some very interesting recommendations, I believe. There are about 30 recommendations in here. And all the recommendations are directed at reducing poverty and increasing opportunity in America. Now let me say one thing about the framing of this debate. For many years, the debate has been framed primarily as poverty or as inequality. And that's not, I mean, it makes sense to frame the debate that way, but politically it might not be very wise. The word poverty has a long and difficult history. Most people associate poverty, especially in Washington, primarily with Lyndon Johnson, which makes it partisan right off the bat. And inequality, Republicans immediately take on the defensive because they think that the inequality is, caused by poor government policy, and people are going to say we need to spend more money. And of course, we do need to spend more money. I'll get to that in a minute. But the opportunity. Who could be against opportunity? Who could be against economic opportunity in America? The American dream, Horatio Alger, they're coming to America, go west, young man. Our Americana is stuffed with opportunity. And it'd be very difficult, certainly publicly, to ever disagree with framing this debate as one of how do we promote opportunity in America. If we were to say how to promote equality of outcome, that would be different. That would make it much more partisan. And many people do not want to think that government should accept the responsibility for outcomes, and in fact, I agree with that. But opportunity would seem to have the possibility of uniting all sides. And I can tell you, since we published this book, we've had a number of discussions with bipartisan groups of people who are quite powerful, former elected members of Congress, and everyone seems to, they're virtually in unanimous agreement that this debate should be formed as one of opportunity. So what kind of policies would promote opportunity in America? And that's what I'd like to talk about. So let's change the slide here. And the first question that arises, this is something like a problem statement, which is the first step in a careful analysis of a policy. Why is poverty so stubborn and inequality so difficult to deal with? And I think there are a whole range of answers. It's like all of our big public issues. There are lots and lots and lots of factors that contribute. But I think these are the four main ones. In fact, I think work rates and wages, family composition, and education are the three most important, but immigration does play a role. So let's talk just briefly about each of these. Do the slide again, will you please? So let's begin with work rates and wages. Slide, okay. So now here we are. These are wages. The way this chart is constructed is that you have the wage rates on the ordinate and the, I gotta get my, let's see, and then years. So what's happened to wage rate over the years? I'm sorry, this is employment to population ratio. We'll do wage rates next. So here, these are white males, these are black males, and these are all males, black males, and females, all females. So you can see the story is not necessarily a great one. Work rates were very high in the 60s, and they declined, more or less slowly but steadily all the way down to 90%, so almost a 6 percentage point, which would be like a 12% decline in work by males. And for black males, the story is even worse. And if these were younger black males, the story would be worse yet. So we're all the way down almost to 80%. So very substantial declines. Gradual, but over time, and they're moving in the wrong direction. So there's less work by males than there has been in the past. And if you have less work, then obviously you have less income. Females, by contrast, very substantial increases. And this is pretty much across the board. I'll show you another slide in a minute. In fact, change the slides for a minute. This is work by females who had families. So it's single parents. This is a group of females that's very different than the entire group of mothers or the entire group of females in the United States. They tend to be lower income. And you can see that with very substantial increase. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. And then mostly associated with recessions, declines, but still the point is that we're way above where we were in 1996. And a lot of this is associated with welfare reform. We'll come back and talk about in a minute. And then if you look at the other side of this, households with no employment at all, you'll see, of course, that there's been a decline. There has to be, because the work has gone up and non-work has gone down. So more households that are headed by females and I'll show you some information in a minute, that these are the households that are most likely to produce kids in poverty and most likely to produce kids who have a difficult time seizing opportunity in the United States. So this is a good part of the story. The male part is not. This is a good part of the story. Next slide. Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, this is the wages now. And here we have wages over time and the percentage of wages relative to 1979, which was a peak point in the economy. And this is wages at the 10th percentile, at the median, and then at the 95th percentile. And as you can see, over the 30-year period, wages declined quite substantially, and then were more or less flat, and then they came back up. They declined a little bit as a result of recessions. But the amazing thing here is that the wages at the 10th percentile, and we've done very careful analytic work at Brookings to show that we are always going to have people at the 10th percentile. Isn't that an amazing conclusion? We'll always have people at the 10th percentile. That's a joke, y'all. And for 3 decades, there's essentially been no increase in wages. Now, how are you supposed to fight poverty and increase opportunity in America when the American economy has essentially flat wages for anybody at the 10th percentile or below? So wages are a big part of this story. The other side of that is education. We'll get that in a minute. At the 50th percentile, it was pretty flat. It came up. The 90s were very good in many ways, not least for wages. And they were even good for wages at the bottom. It's a good thing. Otherwise, the wages would have been way below where they were in 1979. And then if you look at income wages, many, many types of information show that the closer you get to the top, the bigger the increase. So wages increase quite dramatically at the top. And if we were to take this to 99th percentile, or even the 99.9 percentile, and this thing just goes almost vertical. Huge increases. Of course, now after the recession, it's going the other way, and there are huge impacts at the top, and it's going down very substantially. But so this is why we've had a lot. I mean, the American economy's been very productive. We've had a lot of jobs, a lot of employment, but we haven't really done much about inequality because of the distribution of the way wages are earned by people at various points in the wage distribution. So next slide. So the next issue is family composition. And family composition is another major part of the story here. So let's look at the next slide. This is non-marital births. And non-marital births lead to the highest poverty rates of any demographic group in the country. And there are substantial increases, there's substantial impacts on the children's long-term well-being. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So here you see the rate of per thousand of women 15 to 44, and here's the percentage of all births. We start out here in the 50s and 60s with fairly low rates, and then a very gradual climb, and kind of a leveling off at about the time of welfare reform in the mid-1990s, but now another increase. So we have huge, unprecedented percentage of our kids, about 40% of all kids being born, about 38% of all kids being born outside marriage, and even with the rate stable for a while and then increasing, and the percentage stable for a while in the 90s and increasing, we still have a huge percentage of our kids. And here's why it's important. Next slide. So there are big differences by income groups in the likelihood that people are going to have babies outside marriage. If you look by education, you can see that less than 12 years, so high school dropouts, very substantial increases in a very high rate, and then it goes very orderly. For kids who have just a high school but no more than a high school, pretty substantial increases, but still a big difference. And 13, some college, an increase, but not nearly as much as high school dropouts or high school. And then college women, women with a college education are very unlikely to have babies outside marriage. So if you think about this for a minute, the result is that you have people who are already at a substantial disadvantage because of their educational background, and now they have a baby outside marriage. And even if they're cohabiting, the likelihood that they will stay together is very low. So this contributes greatly to the poverty rate, a much higher likelihood that they'll wind up in poverty. And similarly, we have big differences between the races. Blacks are much more likely, almost 70% of black babies are born outside marriage. About half of the others go through a divorce. So the total is around 80% of black children who spend some period during their childhood in mostly in a female-headed family. And Hispanics are between whites. Whites are still increasing very substantially. Is that showing? Can you see that? I can't see that. So here's whites, blacks, and Hispanics in the middle. The very interesting thing about Hispanics is when they come to the United States, the first generation, the non-marital birth rates are very low, in part because the marriage rates are very high. But they get Americanized real quickly, and they get Americanized, they get assimilated in a downward direction, at least in this case, and some other cases as well, so that they have very high and still growing rates of non-marital births. So this is how we get to having, between 35 and 40% of our kids born outside marriage. Next slide. Now you see why it's so important, because look at the differences in poverty rates. Some years it's 7 or 8 times as likely to be in poverty if you're in a female-headed family as if you're in a married couple family. And even now, after this big decline, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, there still is about a 5-fold difference in poverty rates between kids in female-headed families and kids in married couple families. So now think of this. This divorce and non-marital births are like an engine driving poverty, because we're putting more and more, next slide, more and more of our children are in single-parent families. This is a blip in Census Bureau data. I don't think anybody completely understands this. But so we have over a quarter of our kids at any given moment who live in a female-headed family. So even if you were making progress in wages and employment and the other fronts, you still would be swimming upstream, because you've got this engine increasing poverty rates, because a higher and higher percentage of our kids are living in female-headed families. But as we've already seen, wages and work are not, for women, work is moving in the right direction, but not for males, and wages certainly are not moving in the right direction. So you put this together, and it's not a happy picture. We have a lot of problems in our economy and in our personal behavior that are leading to increases in poverty and reductions in personal opportunity. Show the next slide. So now let's turn to education. Go ahead, next slide. These are really spectacular data, I think. This shows over time, and the median family income of people with various levels of education, from those who are high school dropouts to those who have advanced degrees. And as you can see, high school dropout, just high school, some college, and then more recently we've been able to get data on completing a 2-year degree of some sort, 4-year degree, and some either professional degree or graduate work. And not only are the data perfectly orderly, going all the way back to the 60s, that there's always been a separation, so it always paid to get more education. The more education you have, the more money you make. But the differences between the various levels of education have grown very substantially. And most importantly, get this, since roughly the early 1970s, nobody, look at these directions, down, 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 down. The direction of every group has been wrong, has been going down, except for those who have at least a 4-year degree. So education is a problem as well. Education is the solution to this. I'll show you some more stuff later that shows you how crucial education is. But unfortunately, anybody who falls in the lower education groups not only has low income, but it's moving in the wrong direction over time. Show the next slide. So what's been happening with education? From about 1900 to roughly 1970, we had big increases in the likelihood that both men and women, and the same thing with ethnicity, Asians, white, blacks, and Hispanics, big increases in completing high school, and then it leveled off. So since roughly the 1970s, we've made relatively little progress again in high school completion. Next slide. And in college, you see the same sort of pattern, very substantial increase by both males and females. And once again, by the way, we see that women are doing better than men. In fact, listen to this. Well, I went to the University of North Carolina in 1966, and at that time, at the University of North Carolina, one of the great public universities in the country, women could not go as freshmen or sophomores. They had to transfer in to the University of North Carolina, having gone to, say, UNC Greensboro or some, 2-year community college. 3 years ago, for the first time, both the medical school and the law school, the majority of the entering class was females. So this has really been a revolution. I already showed you the employment rates. Same thing with wages. Women are still on average below men, but women are doing extremely well in education and employment and even in wages and entering many of the top positions in industry and business in the United States. And part of it begins, I think, with college degrees. Women have surpassed men. I'd be worried about men if I were an American, I'll tell you. Ethnicity, the same kind of pattern we saw before. Big increases for Asians, and Asians are far above even whites, and whites above blacks and Hispanics, who are really quite low. But for all the groups except Asians, very little progress in approximately the last decade or so. Next slide. And now these are school achievement scores. This is the famous National Assessment of Educational Progress. Really, this is a wonderful thing for the nation to have. We know on average what our schools are doing, and the answer is that they're pretty flat. For 17-year-olds, for 13-year-olds, 9-year-olds, there's a little blip here at the end, and there's a little blip down here, but not very much progress, and hardly any for the other grades. So the schools are continuing to turn out a fairly mediocre product and are not contributing greatly to education, which we saw on the previous slide would really have a big impact on poverty and on opportunity in the United States, and the schools are not making much of a contribution. Next slide. Post-secondary is even more important. Post-secondary can have major impacts, which we'll see in just a minute. This shows you the probability that people of different income levels, from families, from parents of different income levels, will enter college, those are the kind of burgundy bars, and will graduate with a degree, and those are the blue bars. This is everybody. And now we look just at the top quintile. So this is the top 20% in the late 90s, early 2000s. That would have been roughly a little bit less than $120,000. And as you can see, the probability that a kid from a family like that would enter college is almost 80%, and the probability they finish is 53%. Now if we go all the way down to the bottom, kids who are from families at the bottom, so this is roughly below 35,000 or so, again in the late 90s and early 2000s, only 34% chance of entering college compared to 79, and only an 11% chance, approximately 1 out of 10, finish college compared to over half of kids from the upper quintile, so upper fifth. So what this shows, of course, is that the university, which could be a mechanism for really promoting opportunity in the United States, actually reinforces the patterns that kids bring from their families. So we need to reflect on what we could do to get more kids from low-income families into college. Some people say we have too many in college and their dropout rates are high, which indeed they are, as you can see. But to my way of thinking, that's no excuse for backing off on this issue. Okay, next slide. Now, just a few words about immigration. It's the last time I talk about immigration, but I thought it was appropriate to talk about immigration coming to Las Vegas, Nevada, anywhere in the Southwest. First of all, you can see here, this is Census Bureau data, and in fact, this slide is almost directly taken from a Census Bureau publication. The most interesting thing about this slide is a big increase in immigration starting in the 1990s. And this would continue all the way through 2005. It's dropped off a little bit probably in the last couple of years, but still it's very high. This is historically very, very high rates of immigration. In fact, in terms of the number of immigrants, it's the highest ever. Not in terms of the percentage of the population, but it's very high. And the second thing to note about this is the composition, that we've had a very substantial change since the 60s, where we now have more people from South America and Latin America, especially Mexico. Mexico dominates these data, and undocumented also are very prominent in this group. Big increases in Asians, and now a very substantial fraction of immigrants are from Asia. And then Europe and Canada has declined and then held kind of steady. And then others, there have been some increases in others. So we have very high levels of immigration, and we have very high levels from South America. And as you think about this for a minute, South American countries generally have very low levels of education as compared with European countries and Asian countries. There are also big other differences in these two countries, but because of that, it would not be surprising. Let's show the next slide. that the wages have really shifted very substantially. So in 1940, relative to the wages of the average American worker, the average immigrant earned almost 6% more in 1940. Then in 1970, they earned just a little over 1% more than the average worker, and now in 2000, 20% less than the average worker. And this directly reflects the preparation of immigrants, the typical immigrant in the United States, for the American economy and doing well in the American economy, whereas we've seen previously, high education is what really leads to higher wages. Now let me put a footnote on this, it's very important, and that is a way to think of the immigrants to the United States is a very bimodal distribution. A huge diversity in immigrants. We have a lot of immigrants from China and India and other nations, European nations, even though their level of immigration is low, who are highly educated, they do very well, their kids do very well. They look like the 1940 immigrants. They're above average and they're doing very well. But then we have a much larger number of immigrants who are from South America, who are poorly educated, who have low skills, and they come and they work in non-skilled occupations in the United States and generally earn not very much money, and that's why you see this substantial decline, very consistent over time, as the percentage of people from of immigrants with low education come to the United States. Show the next slide, and you can see that this carries over then into the second generation. The second generation, come to America, create opportunity not only for yourself but for your child, and as you can see in the second generation, very high wages relative to those American workers, even higher than in the first generation, and the same thing here, and the same thing, but the difference is going down. It's going in the same direction as the average skills. So the first generation declined in average wages, and the second generation declines in average wages. So it's not like we get a lot of unskilled immigrants, and then in the second generation they pop up and they do very well. And if we look at them comparatively, look at the next slide, you can see the same thing, 1940 compared to 1970, first generation, second generation. This is the pattern we just saw, and here's the pattern again. Notice the very substantial decline here, so there's a decline here. And now we look at this generation. We, of course, don't have the data yet for 2030, but when we do, it seems virtually certain that even in the second generation that there'll still be very low wages. And when you combine these with the original data, the first slide showing the dramatic increase in immigration and the continuing increase over at least 2 decades now and continuing now for at least another 5 years, and no indication that it'll slow down a little bit as a result of recession, but I would expect it to pick right back up. And then you see this pattern of skills and wages, relative wages. So I think it's a safe conclusion that immigration to the United States adds at least a full percentage point, maybe somewhat more, to the poverty level in the United States. Having said that, though, realize that coming to America, the American dream, is still very true. If you think of what these immigrants would earn in their native countries, there have been a very substantial increase in their well-being. They are doing much better on average than they would have done in their native country. So someone who comes here from Mexico, generally speaking, economic analysis shows they earn roughly 4 or 5 times as much as they would in their native country. And similarly, their kids, even though relative to the past, they're not that high. Relative to their actual situation when they came to the United States, they're doing quite well. So in that sense, the American dream for immigration still holds, and they are doing better. And indeed, if we took into account the wage they would have made in their own country and the wage they make in the United States, inequality and mobility up the income scale is much higher than indicated in many academic studies, because of course they never look at what happens to the wage that they would have received in their original country. So immigration definitely is a part of this story. And of course, in a place like Nevada, where you have a very high percentage of immigrants, some of the school systems in Nevada have 50% of kids are immigrants. It has an impact on the achievement in the schools, and of course, and now and in the future will have an impact on average wages. So it contributes to both poverty and to a lack of opportunity and inequality. Next slide. I think, go backwards. Okay, now let's talk about opportunity and mobility. So far, we've talked about fairly stagnant compared across ages. But what happens if we look within the same generation and from one generation to the next and see what's happened with the financial, with the earnings and the income of various generations? So opportunity and mobility, first slide. All right. What this slide shows is if you take the bottom 20%, so that's roughly all families below about 35,000, and trace their kids. And by the way, let me just say, I know data's boring, but this is an amazing data set. This is the only data set you can really do the kind of analyses that I'm going to show you now. It's a data set from the University of Michigan. They followed 5,000 families starting in 1968, collected all kinds of information on them, just like the Census Bureau. And then they followed their children. So in these data that I'm going to show you now, and I'll show you some more a little bit later, we are comparing the first generation, a random sample of the American population, and then their kids, both at approximately age 40. So this is actually the kids of the people in the first generation, so you can't get better than that. These are really quite reliable data. There are problems in measurement, and there's attrition and all that normal stuff. But this is really fascinating and the best data available. So if you're from the bottom 20%, the probability you'll make it to the top 20% is 6, and the probability that you'll stay in the bottom is 42%. Next slide. And here we see in the next slide the mirror image of this. If we're from the top quintile, people pile up at the top, and they're very unlikely to be in the bottom. So this is a sign of a fairly serious lack of mobility from one generation to the next. There still is mobility. There's mobility down. You can start at the top, and you can make it all the way to the middle or even all the way to the bottom. And so you got about 40%. If it were random, you'd expect about 60% down here. So there's a lot more going on than just random factors. So there is a problem with mobility in the United States, but we still have mobility. We shouldn't say, everybody's stuck where they started. And another interesting, can you go back one slide? Another interesting feature of mobility, and this is true in the United States and in every country that's been studied, but it's more true in the United States than any other country. We call this, it's sticky at the bottom. More than any other group, if I showed you what happens to people from the second 20% and so forth, if your parents are from the bottom, the odds that you're going to be from the bottom are very high. And inversely, if you're from the top, the odds you're going to stay at the top are very high. So things are sticky at the top and the bottom. And in some ways, especially if we're concerned about poverty, that is an extremely important piece of information. For some reason, it's difficult for kids to escape the family background, especially if they're from a low family background. And we wouldn't say it's difficult to escape family background if you're from the top 20% of income of parents, but that's true. It's, the odds that you'll stay up there are very high. So skip the next slide. Okay, now let's look and see what happens if kids get a college degree. I told you before how important college was. So think about this for a minute. These are kids in the second generation, the same group that we've been talking about, who did not get a college degree. And all the kids on the right, they got a 4-year college degree. And each of the bar graphs is the parental generations, the parental income. So here in the parental generation, this is the bottom fifth, and then the second fifth, middle fifth, and so forth, and then the top fifth. And then within the bars shows where the kids wound up. So to look at this one, if the kids are from a family with an income in the bottom 20%, so below roughly 35,000 in the early 2000s, they have a 45% chance of staying in the bottom, even higher than the previous slide, if they did not get a college degree. But look at this. If they did get a college degree, it goes all the way down to 16%. And if you look at the top, they only have a 5% chance of making it all the way to the top, above 100,000, about 115,000, if they don't get a college degree, but they increase by a factor of 4 the chances of making it all the way to the top if they got a college degree. So college has a tremendous impact here. I bet there's some researchers out here. How many studies do you know of where the experimental group on something, a good outcome, has a level 4 times as high as the control group? I mean, this is really a blast. This is a tremendous impact. So post-secondary education can really give a boost to kids from bad backgrounds, from difficult backgrounds, and it can really make a difference on their income. So this is there is plenty of room for optimism here, even though we do have a problem with opportunity. We wish there were more. We should have more. We have some, but we can tell from these data that one of the obvious ways to promote opportunity, which is our major goal, would be to get more kids into college. Not all kids, I'll come to this in a few minutes, but more kids, as many as possible, get a 4-year college degree, and they're going to it's going to have a big impact on their income. Next slide. Now, it's even, for black kids, it's especially disappointing, and I want to show you why. So these are black kids. They're not even enough from the original generation. And remember, that was 68. We passed civil rights legislation in 65. We just have to face up to we're really an extremely racist country until after the civil rights legislation passed. And even today, we still have lots of elements of racism directed both against blacks and to some extent against Hispanics. And so here, if we look at blacks in the bottom 20% and so forth, not enough to look in the top 20%. But notice what happens. In the middle, so this is solidly middle class black parents, and look where their kids wind up. If it were random, it would be 20%. It's 45% to the bottom. So there's nothing like this for whites. So black kids, even in our generation, whose parents were middle income, their parents could not pass their advantages on to their kids nearly as much as white parents could. We don't have data like this for Hispanics. There weren't enough Hispanics in the United States in 1968. Aren't enough in the sample that began in 1968. But there's lots of indications that this applies at least somewhat to Hispanics. So for some reason, it's more difficult for parents in minority groups to pass on their advantages to their children. I don't think we have a very good understanding of this. We could talk about it if you'd like to. I think it's a very important issue, but it really is a very discouraging phenomenon. Next slide. This is mobility within the same generation. So the probability that kids would cross as they grow up, that they would cross one of the lines between the bottom 20%, second 20%, and so forth. So in 67, 76, it was 61%, and the probability that they would come out of the bottom was 44%, and that has not changed over time. 61, 61, 60, 61, same thing with the bottom. So I have seen many references in the New York Times and elsewhere to the declining rates of mobility in the United States. There's not even a suggestion of that here. We do have a problem with mobility, but it has not increased over time. It's not getting more difficult to do better over the course of a lifetime. Next slide. So let's summarize our situation before we start talking about solutions. The first thing is that wages and income are stagnant or falling at the bottom. They came up very nicely in the last 20 years, as we saw, but they only reached a point where they were 3 and 4 decades ago. So a big problem with stagnant wages at the bottom, so much so that all the people at the 10th percentile and slightly above that are going to have a hard time advancing. Second, work rates for men are falling. Again, that's a very discouraging outcome, especially for married couple families, because men are not able to contribute. And in fact, in today's generation, on average, males earn less than their fathers did. So males are a problem. And marriage rates have been declining, especially among the poor. Non-member birth rates have been skyrocketing, so we have an increasing percentage of our kids in female-headed families where the poverty rate is 5 times as high as it is among married couple families. And average wages and probably skills of immigrants in both the first and second generation have been declining for over half a century. So this adds more to the problem. And educational achievement is stagnant. Education makes a big difference, but the educational achievement on average, either measured as how much people learn while they're in school or how many years of schooling people complete, has been stagnant for at least 2 decades. All right, next slide. So back. You're fast. Are you in a hurry to get home? She wants to get home, so she's going to go skip the slides. All right, and someone out there might be thinking, well, it would be about the same if you skipped every other slide. It's hard to follow this stuff. Okay, so what to do about it? That's the big question, and that's why Belle and I wrote this book, is because we really think we should be able to make more progress. We should make more progress. So how do we do it? Next slide. All right, so we thought and thought and thought, and we came up with this really radical agenda of what we should do to increase mobility in the United States and reduce poverty. We should improve education, we should expand work, and we should strengthen families. Now, is that original or what? I mean, people at Brookings are smart. Next slide. So I want to show you two things right at the beginning that I think bear on everything else that I'm going to say here. The first is, we say that there are three norms. Now, a lot of scholars do not like to talk like this. This is judgmental. We're going to be judgmental here, okay? We're going to say there are three norms of behavior that every kid should learn. Our schools should emphasize it, parents should emphasize it, churches, community organizations. Rule 1, complete high school at least. Rule 2, work full-time. Rule 3, wait until age 21 and get married before you have children. If you follow those three rules, the probability that you will be in poverty is 2%, and even more to the point, the probability that your spouse and your children will be in poverty is 2%. And the probability you make the middle class defined as 50,000 or above is almost 3/4, almost 75%. On the other hand, if you don't follow any of the norms, the probability you'll be in poverty is 76%, and the probability you'll make the middle class is 7%. Now, come on. These are not very elaborate and sophisticated rules, right? If we could just get our kids to follow these three fairly straightforward rules, it would have an enormous impact on poverty and mobility in the United States, way more than any government program that anybody has ever thought of. So individual responsibility, doing the right thing, is really a crucial enterprise, and everything that we think about in terms of poverty should be focused, at least in part, on doing everything we can to get kids as they grow up to make the right decision for their future and for the future of their children. Next slide. All right, so this is the kind of stuff we do at Brookings. We sit around and think, well, I wonder what would happen if. So this is based on Census Bureau data, random sample of the United States, and then just ask a simple question. What would happen to the poverty rate if I changed one thing? So if I were God, and I could change one characteristic of the American population, one thing at a time, what would happen to poverty? So let's first assume that everybody works full-time. So what this means is they have to work at least 35 hours a week. If they work part-time, they get whatever wage that they would get part-time. If they don't work at all, we estimate their wage by giving the wage what people of that level of education have. And if you did that without any change in government programs, the poverty rate would fall by 42%, almost half. Again, there's no government program that's ever had an impact. There's actually one program that did. I'll tell you about two programs. I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. So full-time work would have the biggest impact. Next is increase the marriage rate. This is not some pie in the sky 100% anything. This is the marriage rate that we had in 1970. So if we we did this analysis using 2002 data, if we had the poverty rate, the marriage rate that we had in 1970, poverty would have fallen by 27% without any other changes. So marriage has a big impact as well. If we increased education, this means everybody has at least a high school degree, poverty would fall 15%. If we reduce family size, this means we're not recommending this, but if no family had more than 2 kids, poverty would fall 13%. If we doubled cash welfare, which is not going to happen it's not going to happen in God's lifetime in the United States of America, we would reduce poverty 8%. And if we did all these things, we could reduce poverty 71%. But what I want to call your attention to is, just in the most naive possible way, there are lots of issues with this analysis, especially something called selection effects, we can talk about if you want to. But just thinking of it this way, if you're a poverty warrior and you want to reduce poverty and increase opportunity in the United States, the first thing you're going to do is try to increase work rates. And the second thing you're going to try to do is do something about our marriage rate and get especially more of our kids being reared in married couple families, and obviously increase education. So these first 2 slides, I just want to kind of set the stage for you about how we were thinking when we decided on what policies we would favor. Next slide. All right, so the first strategy that you could use to reduce poverty, this is again very profound, and that is give them money. Now I bring this up for 2 reasons. The first one is that's essentially what welfare is. But this is Social Security. And there are many, many studies that show this. Scholars get excited about it. You give them money, they're not poor anymore. Very sophisticated analyses to show that the reduction in the poverty rate, this is actually what happened among the elderly, was due almost 100% to Social Security. that Social Security payments increased. The Ways and Means Committee, Al Allman, I don't know if any of you remember him, played a big role in this, but it was bipartisan. You can't blame either one of the parties. They were all hitting for votes, and they want the elderly vote, which is so huge. And you get this just monstrous decline in poverty, and then it declines gradually over the years, so that now we have a society, and you know, if you think of history, this has never happened in history. Elderly are always the poorest because they can't work anymore. Now when they can work, they're not the poorest anymore, but it's primarily because of government programs. There are other factors, but government programs are the most important. Okay, so obviously we could give people money through welfare and they wouldn't be poor. We're not going to do that. We had a welfare system that did that gave money away under the old Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. They were still likely to be poor. It wasn't very much. In fact, it was miserly, and it declined year after year after year. But we're not even going back to that point. I'll talk more about this in just a minute. But we're not, this strategy, forget it. It's not, we're not going to do it. Next slide. Okay, so the next thing we do is promote work. Show the next slide. So now I want to show you what actually happened when we adopted this policy. In 1996, we passed welfare reform. And we had a huge debate in Congress. It was ugly. That's the only thing to say. It was more or less the equivalent of the current health debate. Democrats called Republicans Nazis and all kinds of other flattering things. Members of Congress, if you can believe they're generally such a gentlemanly lot, as most of you probably know, they actually had the audacity to say things about each other's parentage, if you can imagine that. So the bill passed anyway. Bill Clinton played a huge role in it. In the final analysis, half of the Democrats in Congress voted for the bill. Almost every Republican, signed by a Democratic president. This is a highly bipartisan decision to pass this legislation. And here's what it did. First of all, it ended the cash entitlement. This is absolutely critical. The philosophy of welfare before this was, you deserve money from the government if you don't work and have a baby you can't support. That's what we did. And now we said we explicitly eliminated that language, completely rewrote the text and renamed the program when the new program is called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And we explicitly have in the text a line that says there's no entitlement under this program. Second, funding was given to the states in the block grants. Under the old system, if a state added more people to welfare rolls, federal government gave more money. If they did the right thing like Wisconsin and Utah and a number of other states did and helped people get off welfare through employment, the federal government took away some of their money. This is not a very good incentive system. So now under this new legislation, the states get a flat amount of funding. If they get people off welfare, they keep the change, so to speak. So there's a very substantial financial incentive for the states to help people get off welfare. There's also a financial incentive for them to throw people off welfare and be unfair, and that has happened in some states, but generally it is not. Very strong work requirements. We've always had, we had what I would call work murmurs in previous legislation, but these are real work requirements on the states and on individuals. Every individual has a requirement to work, and if they violate it, the states must reduce their benefit. And in 27 states, they completely eliminate the benefit eventually. Sometimes there's a step-by-step procedure. And sanctions, those are the sanctions. So the sanctions are really an important part of this. We also have the sanctions on the states, though. If the states don't meet these work requirements, then that block grant of money that they get is reduced. So the states are highly motivated to try to meet the work requirements as well. And then finally, the 5-year time limit, which is extremely controversial, that people are, states are supposed to tell people when they apply for welfare, you have 5 years and that's it, no benefits after 5 years. There are some exceptions, but that was the rule. And it was to send a signal to everybody that welfare is temporary assistance for needy families. So what happened? Change the slide. Oh, you did? Okay, good. All right, so here's the welfare rolls. You know, I used to love it. After welfare reform passed, you can see the rolls coming down very substantially here after the mid-1990s. The New York Times would always write stories about welfare reform, and they say, well, the rolls are really coming down, but it's a good economy. And in the past, whenever there was a good economy, the rolls, of course, would come down. So I urge you to look at the past, and oh, there it is there. That's about the only time the rolls declined. Welfare rolls just kept going up and up and up through good economies. They leveled off a little bit during good economies, but the direction was up. And now look at this, just a huge decline, completely unprecedented. Eventually, in the country as a whole, 60% of the caseload left. Next slide. And where did they go? So here are the employment to population ratios for all single mothers Look at this. All of a sudden they start going up in the early 1990s, starting about 92 or 93, and they go very high. They level off, and they fall off a little bit. This is all single parents, which are very high probability they're on welfare. And then here's never married single parents, and and sometimes 85% of this group is on welfare, or at least that was the case in the past. So it's fairly stable, and then all of a sudden you see this huge increase right around welfare reform, 40% increase over 4 years. This is the group of mothers who are least prepared for work, most likely to be high school dropouts and so forth, and yet you get this substantial increase in employment among this very group. Next slide. And as a result of that, if you take the bottom 40%, which includes virtually all the families that are on welfare at that moment in any given year, and families that left welfare at any given time, so this would be families, for female-headed families, this is families under around 26,000. You can see that their income from means-tested benefits, which is primarily cash, the old AFDC program, and then the new TANF program, goes down during this period after welfare reform, as you would expect, because they're leaving welfare, so they're getting less money. And then if you look at their earnings plus earned income tax credit, you can see that it starts going up and goes up very substantially after welfare reform passes. It came down after the recession in 2000, but it's still much higher than it was before welfare reform. So, and if you look at this point right here, this is about a 30% difference as compared with pre-welfare income if you add these two together, and there are a few other categories that are left out here. But the families were better off about 30%. And even here, after recession and the dropping off, not the most recent recession, but the 2001 recession, the families are about 20% better off. So it won't surprise you to hear, next slide, that child poverty fell. And you know, if you think back to that original slide, very little progress against poverty among kids in female-headed families, which have very high poverty rates, or among black kids, and then this very substantial decline. And even by this point, we're already at the lowest poverty rates for blacks and kids in female-headed families in history. And it still goes down after that. It goes back up. It's certainly going up now, but look at, still very different than it was before welfare reform. So even now, the poverty rate among children in female-headed families is about 20% below where it was before welfare reform. So welfare reform really had a major impact on poverty rates. Next slide. Now, this is really a very important thing. I think this is the single most important point about American social policy and changes in social policy over the last 20 years or so, with the exception of health legislation just passed. This is huge. All right, these are the programs that are given, and here's the key. I call these work support. These are programs that support low-income working families. It's, in a way, think of it as kind of the opposite of the old AFDC program, where you have to be on welfare to get the money. Under these programs, you don't. You have to work to get the money. So child care, of course, S-CHIP, which is, think of it as Medicaid, they go together, so it's health insurance for kids. The child tax credit, which was passed in 1997, and the earned income tax credit was passed in 65 and has been increased 3 times, especially in 1993, just before welfare reform. So think of it this way. This is the American population random sample in 1999, based on Census Bureau data. And we just raised this question. If all this policy, all these programs had been exactly as they had been in the mid-1980s and had not changed, then in 1999, we would have spent $5.6 billion supporting these low-income working families. But no, Congress, if you can believe this, had what looks a lot like vision. And they said, we're going to change these programs. We're going to help low-income working families to give them incentive to get off welfare. And so every single one of these programs either expanded or was created out of whole cloth, like S-CHIP and the child tax credit. And as a result of that, we would spend $52 billion, compare this to this, on low-income working families. So we had 2 revolutions that reduced poverty and dramatically promoted opportunity. The first revolution is welfare reform, to get people in the workforce, but the second is to support people, low-income people, a lot more when they go into the workforce. Now, this is extremely critical, and the reason is that for the foreseeable future, we are, and think of the education data now, we are going to have a lot of our children, 20% at least, maybe 30%, that are in families that are headed by someone of low skills. We've seen the wages, we see what they're facing. They're not going to be able to escape poverty just through work. So the question arises for a policymaker, would you rather have these kids on welfare and their parents on welfare, or would you rather do everything you can to encourage them to work and give them money if they work? So they have to earn the government subsidies. And as taxpayers, which virtually everybody in this room, probably everybody, will be taxpayers eventually if you're not now, many of us are already, don't you think that's a good bargain? Don't you think that's a wise thing to do? Besides that, you probably don't particularly want those kids living in poverty. So this is extremely wise. It's expensive, but it's extremely wise policy. We now spend something on the order of $700 billion, the federal government does, and the states spend not that much but a lot on programs that try to promote opportunity, and these are some of the most important programs that do that. And they don't apply just to low-income mothers. Okay, next slide. So it's a combination, it's the two revolutions that really, this is the most successful thing that we've done to reduce poverty and increase opportunity in the United States. Next slide. What? Oh, 5 minutes? You want me to finish? Okay, good. Okay, so how should we increase work? That's how we can put this into operation. And the answer is we have very weak requirements in the food stamp program. We have virtually no work requirements in the housing program. They should be dramatically strengthened. We should bring back industrial arts in the high school. We have experimental evidence from something called career academies where we give kids an early exposure to work during high school. And those kids, 8 years later, have 16% more earnings than kids who were not in the program. So it's a very substantial impact. And then we should strengthen the work support system. That last thing I showed you, we need more money in daycare, and we need more money for employment and training. Next slide. All right, so promote education. I'm only going to talk about preschool. In our book, we make recommendations for preschool, K-12, and post-secondary. Let's just talk about preschool. Go ahead. All right, so this is two of the best programs are the Perry Preschool program and Abecedarian program. There's another program in Chicago that was much bigger than either of those programs that produced similar results. So teen parent rates from Abecedarian, comparison with the control group, the group that got the program, 26%, the control group 45%. And if you look down here, you can see on every one of these important life outcome variables, the kids who were in the experimental group with random assignment meets the requirements of scientific investigation did way better, okay? And even on income, there are impacts on income. They're not huge, but they're impacts. Next slide. However, to get these, you have to have high quality. So here are, these are the impacts of the Abecedarian program, and here's the impact of state pre-K, which is still pretty good. It's a separate program that are run by the states, and here's the impact of Head Start. Head Start's our single biggest investment. It's about $7 billion. It just was increased by President Obama. It's almost 1 million kids in Head Start, and we're producing fairly mediocre outcomes. So we need some changes in Head Start. That's the first thing. Next slide. Now this is a random sample of American kids. It's probably the best data we have on the quality of preschool. And as you can see, 10% of kids are in facilities that are poor quality, 70% are in mediocre quality, and 20% in good quality. So here's the problem. 80% of our kids are in preschool that will not enhance their development. So we've got to do something about preschool if we want to really send these kids into public school and boost education. Next slide. And this is just intended to show you that we spend a lot of money, so we could have a lot of impact if we had high quality in government programs. We spend $26 million. It's actually higher now because the president has proposed to actually pass some and propose additional. It's probably more like $28 billion. So if we change federal policy and work with the states to get states to change policy, we could have big impacts. Next slide. This is a model preschool program. I'll be happy to talk about that later if you want to. Next slide. All right, so final strategy is strengthening marriage, and two things are required: reduce non-marital births, and especially to teens. By the way, non-marital births for teens decreased every year between 1991. It was spectacular data all the way down until 2004, and then it increased for 2 years in a row. People were really upset. This morning, the data was published, I think the most recent year is 2007, and there's a 2% decline again. So we're back on the right path on teen pregnancy. So it's a great success story, and we should increase marriage rates. There's no evidence we know how to do that, but next slide. These are characteristics of effective teen programs. There's a huge literature now, jammed with random assignment studies. We really know a lot about teen pregnancy. And if we had these programs all over the country that meet these requirements, that focus on one or more sexual behaviors that lead to unintended pregnancy, so that would be abstinence or use of condoms, employ behavioral methods and materials and so forth to help kids get their way out of a sexual experience. In fact, down here, a lot of the good programs have teach and practice refusal skills, a really important thing for, especially for young girls. And usually if boys and girls are not going to have sex, it's because the girls are going to say no. And a lot of girls don't do it because of social pressure, but these programs teach them how to say no in a way that is not embarrassing and so forth. So we even know about the characteristics of successful programs. There's no doubt in my mind that if we had these programs, we could reduce teen pregnancy, and that would, in the long term, have an important impact. Next slide. This is the Bush administration marriage initiative, marriage education and several existing programs, child protection, Head Start, refugees, a separate initiative for Hispanic and black marriage, and then research and demonstrations. This is one thing that Bush definitely did right. We have large-scale random assignment experiments to see if these programs would work. We have one of them in Baltimore. I visited several times. I visited 3 of the programs myself. They're really fascinating programs. I'm not going to have time to tell you much more about them. But I will tell you that starting in about 2 months, we're going to get reports from Mathematica, and then we're going to get a whole series of reports about whether these programs were successful in increasing marriage rates or in prolonging marriage that already existed. Most of the people in the programs had already had a baby outside marriage, and many of them cohabited. They said they had a close relationship, and so the goal of the program was to help them promote their relationship, avoid violence, promote parenting skills, learn how to argue without being physical, and the things that good marriages consist of. There's a long literature going back 40 years that showed that these programs with middle-class families work. There's no evidence with low-income families, so we're about to get some evidence. Next slide. I was going to show you some information from one of the programs, but I'm being thrown off the podium here, which is probably a good thing for all the people in this audience. So let me conclude then by saying that a lot of factors are moving in the wrong direction if we want to reduce poverty and increase economic opportunity in America. But there are things that we can do in policy. In our book, we make a total of 27 recommendations that would cost about $20 billion a year to implement. I guess I can't be a Republican anymore recommending $20 billion a year in social programs, but that's what we recommend. But we do say how we pay for it, and this is the note I want to conclude on. We would pay for the programs by adjusting payments for the elderly. We call this intergenerational transfers. We are going to absolutely have to do this. We must do this in the future. We have to curtail the growth of spending on the elderly and invest the money in children. If we don't do that, we are going to face an even more difficult economic future. We're still going to have high rates of poverty, and we're going to have dramatic inequality and a lack of opportunity in the United States. Thank you.